Good morning, everyone. Today, my group members and I will be presenting on the heart. Group members are Emil Morris, Samoy Gordon, Javine Hines, and myself, Gaysiana Chambers. The heart is the main organ of the cardiovascular system and is posterior to the sternum. It is surrounded by the pericardial cavity and is lined by the serous membrane pericardium. The size of an individual's heart is the size of a clenched fist. The heart helps with the blood flow through a network of blood vessels. The blood vessels are subdivided into the pulmonary circuit, which carries blood to and from the gas exchange surfaces of the lungs, and the systematic circuit, which transport blood to and from the rest of the body. The heart consists of four muscular chambers. They are the right atrium, the left atrium, the right and the left ventricle. The right atrium receives blood from the systematic circuit and it passes to the right ventricle, which pumps blood into the pulmonary circuit. The left atrium collects blood from the pulmonary circuit and empties it into the left ventricle, which then contracts, ejecting blood into the systematic circuit. The blood vessels of the heart. There are three types of blood vessels that assist the heart to pump blood throughout the body. They are the veins, the arteries, and the capillaries. The veins, otherwise known as the afferent vessels, are responsible for carrying deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. The two major types of veins in the heart are the pulmonary vein, which are responsible for transferring oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart, and also the vena cava. The inferior and the superior vena cava bring deoxygenated blood from the body into the right atrium. Then you have our arteries. The arteries, otherwise known as the afferent vessels, carries the blood away from the heart and is responsible for the oxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. The two major types of arteries of the heart are the aorta, which transport blood away from the heart to the rest of the body from the left ventricle, and the pulmonary arteries, which is responsible for transferring deoxygenated blood to the right ventricle to the lungs. As blood leaves from each chamber of the heart, it passes through a valve which prevents the backward flow of the blood. There are four valves of the heart. You have the tricuspid valve, the pulmonary valve, and the mitral valve, and also the aortic valve. This is a diagram of the heart and highlighting the parts of the heart. Now, Nurse Hines will present on the coronary arterial blood flow of the heart.
There are two main coronary arteries, and they are the left main and the right coronary artery. Coronary arteries are important because they deliver blood to the heart muscle. So any disease in relation to them can have serious implications by decreasing the flow of oxygen and nutrients to the heart. On the screen, there's a diagram showing the coronary arteries. There are the types of coronary arteries. You have the left coronary artery, which is also known as the left main trunk, and it supplies blood to the left side of the heart, namely the left ventricle and left atrium. You also have the circumflex artery, and that supplies blood to the outer side and back of the heart. There is the left anterior descending artery, which supplies blood to the front of the septum and front and bottom of the left ventricle. There's also the right coronary artery, which supplies blood to the right atrium, right ventricle, sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes. And next, the right marginal artery that supply most of the myocardium of the right ventricle of the heart. And there's a posterior descending artery that supply blood to the inferior aspect of the heart. And lastly, there's a diagonal artery which supply blood to the anterior lateral papillary muscle and the anterior and lateral portions of the heart. We'll be hearing from Nurse Garden speaking on the cardiac cycle.
The cardiac cycle. The period between the start of one heartbeat and the beginning of the next is known as one cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle shows alternating periods of contraction and relaxation. There are four main phases of the cardiac cycle. They are the atrial systole, the atrial diastole, the ventricular systole, and the ventricular diastole. Now, we'll be playing a YouTube animation detailing the cardiac cycle and its different phases.
Cardiac cycle refers to the sequence of events that occur and repeat with every heartbeat. It can be divided into two major phases, systole and diastole, each of which subdivides into several smaller phases. Systole and diastole, when not specified otherwise, refer to ventricular contraction and relaxation, respectively. Reminders: blood flows from higher to lower pressure. Contraction increases the pressure within a chamber, while relaxation lowers the pressure. AV valves open when atrial pressures are higher than ventricular pressures and close when the pressure gradient is reversed. Similarly, semilunar valves open when ventricular pressures are higher than aortic pulmonary pressures and close when the reverse is true. The cycle is initiated with the firing of the SA node that stimulates the atria to depolarize. This is represented by the P wave on the ECG. Atrial contraction starts shortly after the P wave begins and causes the pressure within the atria to increase, forcing blood into the ventricles. Atrial contraction, however, only accounts for a fraction of ventricular filling because at this point, the ventricles are already almost full due to passive blood flow down the ventricles through the open AV valves. As atrial contraction completes, atrial pressure begins to fall, reversing the pressure gradient across the AV valves, causing them to close. The closing of the AV valves produces the first heart sound, S1, and marks the beginning of systole. At this point, ventricular depolarization, represented by the QRS complex, is halfway through, and the ventricles start to contract, rapidly building up pressures inside the ventricles. For a moment, however, the semilunar valves remain closed, and the ventricles contract within a closed space. This phase is referred to as isovolumetric contraction because no blood is ejected and ventricular volume is unchanged. Ventricular ejection starts when ventricular pressures exceed the pressures within the aorta and pulmonary artery. The aortic and pulmonic valves open and blood is ejected out of the ventricles. This is the rapid ejection phase. As ventricular repolarization, reflected by the T wave, begins, ventricular pressure starts to fall and the force of ejection is reduced. When ventricular pressures drop below aortic and pulmonary pressures, the semilunar valves close, marking the end of systole and beginning of diastole. Closure of semilunar valves produces the second heart sound, S2. The first part of diastole is, again, isovolumetric, as the ventricles relax with all valves closed. Ventricular pressure drops rapidly, but their volumes remain unchanged. Meanwhile, the atria are being filled with blood and atrial pressures rise slowly. Ventricular filling starts when ventricular pressures drop below atrial pressures, causing the AV valve to open, allowing blood to flow down the ventricles passively. The atria contract to finish the filling phase, and the cycle repeats itself.
Right, so that's just the end of our video. Next, Nurse Morris will be telling us about what an electrocardiogram is and how it works.
Okay. An electrocardiogram. An electrocardiogram, also known as an ECG, represents an electrical signal tracing of the heart and is recorded non-invasively from the surface of the body. This test is painless and it is used to quickly detect heart problems and monitor the conditions of a person's heart. Okay, P wave is this is a small deflection wave that represents arterial depolarization. The PR interval is the time between the first deflection of the P wave and the first deflection of the QRX complex. The QRX complex represents ventricular depolarization. The small Q wave corresponds to the depolarization of the interventricular septum. The R wave reflects depolarization of the main mass of the ventricles. Hence, this is the largest wave. The S wave signifies the final depolarization of the ventricles, and this is at the base of the heart. The ST segment, also known as the ST interval, is the time between the end of the QRS complex and the start of the T wave. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization, which is arterial repolarization is observed by the large QRX complex. Okay, and now we will have these were the references that were used to help us to conduct this research. This is the end of our presentation, and thank you for watching.